everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Talk for Writing. My name is Carla Ainscough, and I am a primary school teacher at Stafford Community School in Dubai. I am also part of the media leadership team, and I'm very excited to introduce today's guest speaker. We have Jamie Thomas. Now, Jamie is an accredited Talk for Writing trainer, and he works nationally and internationally as well. And he develops the core systems and practices that lead to sustainable improvements in English. Jamie currently leads all elements of Talk for Writing and reading training, and we are very lucky to have him presenting for us today. I will now hand over to Jamie, who will introduce himself and lead what will no doubt be a fantastic webinar.
Hi and welcome to this little presentation about an introduction to Talk for Writing. My name is Jamie Thomas. I'm one of the Talk for Writing and reading trainers. And today is just to give you a bit of an insight into this fantastic methodology, the principles and practices that lie at its heart, and how this really enables children to find their voice in English. We've also specifically going to think about today how we start with some of our youngest children, getting them really proficient in the English language, telling stories, making up new versions, especially children where English is an additional language can obviously be a slight barrier into that early acquisition. So we'll look at some case studies of schools that have high proportions of EAL but yet do amazing things thanks to this approach. So as I say, my name's Jamie. I'll take you through the journey. Let's begin by thinking about how children actually learn. Children, as we know, they learn by imitation. So from a very young age, children will start to copy and mimic and replicate the things that we do as teachers, whether it's from that early turning the page of a book or handling a book to the moment where they pick up a pen and start mark making. So we've got obviously the Picassos of the future here. And what this tells us is that the way that children learn is through imitation, and imitation is the first phase of Talk for Writing. If we break that down somewhat, it comes down to the way that children learn language. If you think about a child, when they first hear language, they start to connect and react to the stories that they're read to as children. So that first phase is that we grow that phonemic awareness, the ability to hear sounds and connect sounds. Once they can hear sounds and connect with them, then we can start moving on to them copying and replicating. They can hear it, they can mimic it, they can copy us. And then once they can hear it and they can say it, then we can start to look at those words and we can read those words. And that's really the pathway into being able to write. It's what Talk for Writing is built on. We start off by hearing stories. We tell the children rich, incredible stories. We then get them joining in with stories. We get them participating, saying, retelling. It's a sort of cumulative sort of process where we slowly build stories up over time, put them into the long-term working memory, like we call the storehouse, so to speak. And it comes back down to when I first met Pi, he said two things to me, and they've always stayed with me. He said, you can't imagine something out of nothing. Your imagination is the manipulation of what you know. So what we're doing is we're starting to help children putting stories into their imagination by hearing, saying, reading, and then ultimately writing. Now, our role in that as teachers and as schools is that we are the model. We have to model being a storyteller. We model the retelling with expression. We model how to draw stories, how to retell stories, how to invent stories, how to manipulate stories. We constantly recast. We hear inaccuracy and we'll recast it and correct it. We make sure that when children are learning that it's really accurate. When they're working with the teacher, we iron out those misconceptions. And we also extend and challenge. One of the things today is to give you a very brief insight into this approach. Clearly, this is an approach that takes time and investment to really get into the DNA of the school. It's something that evolves all the way from the nursery all the way through into secondary, where each child in their journey, the whole process grows and develops with them to support them in their writing in different phases. We do this in a very memorable, meaningful, repetitive way. Repetition is one of the key ways that all people learn things. So we learn texts, we revisit systematically year on year on year. We put things into the long-term memory. We almost overlearn them so that they really stick and can be quick for the recall. With the generative grammar, the way that the English language is developed and grown systematically over time. Now, if you go back just to think about strategy, some of the strategies we use with young children is we would start Talk for Writing with a rich vein of invention. Now, invention is what we want young children to be able to do. So we might give them what we might call the sort of sentence signposts, and this is very much central to everything we do. We look at the transferable language that will support you in being a successful storyteller. Now, you might like to have a go at doing this one, especially try it with your class of all ages. And this is the idea of a 5-sentence story. So if you took a 5-sentence story, we might start off, and in Talk for Writing we put actions to help acquire the knowledge. So we'd start off with actions like once upon a time, and you can see here I'm just doing a little book, once upon a time. Then we're going to have our character, so we can say who and introduce that. So we have once upon a time there was a dragon who lived on the edge of a dark forest. Then we've got our time of day. One day or one evening he decided to go out and snatch a maiden. Now we're going to go for that problem of the story. Unfortunately, he couldn't find any maidens on his flight and had to fly all around the lands, searching high and low. Luckily, there was one young maiden out collecting a pail of water. Finally, he snatched up his treasured princess and flew back to reward the riches of the kingdom. The concept being here, you can see with the little what we call the sort of S planner, that reversed S planning frame, you've got the icons that deliver the language. So we'll build familiarity. Once upon a time who, early one morning, unfortunately, luckily, finally. And then we can make up stories. What we're giving them is the scaffold, that early language pattern. And once you can do this, you can make up hundreds of stories. We can grow the language over time. We can introduce things like suddenly or at that moment or in the blink of an eye so that children can start to form their stories with growing confidence. This very much sits at the heart of what we do and how it grows, because as this progresses through school, what we look for is finding the sort of what we call the boxing up, which is the sort of spine of our story, the key events that happen and help children plan and grow this. And it becomes very sophisticated as you take this through the whole school model. Now, when we think about young children, I want you to think about this as a model. When we start teaching English to young children, there are two elements that we need to have consideration of. One is we have to grow the transcription of a child. So how confident is that child in their gross and fine motor skills, their letter formation, their sitting on the line, at the same time, their ability to use their phonetical awareness to start to sound out words, phonetically plausible attempts. We're working on all of the transcription. At the same time, while we're growing that with young children, we're going to grow the compositional element by inventing stories, by learning stories, by internalizing stories and rhymes and non-fiction texts. Here we've got an example of one of our training centres in England, St George's. And St George's, which is in Battersea, has sort of around 50% pupil premium. It's got about 60% children with English as additional language. Now, what they do is they understand the growth of a young child by almost growing these two things at the same time. So here you can see the child who is working very hard at their letter formation, sitting on the line, using their sounds. And all of the children in their reception class by October will start to write and make phonetically plausible attempts. But the amazing bit is what happens next, because whilst they're doing this, they're learning these stories, this rich vein of story retelling. And so 7 months later, it starts to explode onto the page. And you can see here a version, an innovation as we would call it, a new version of Jack and the Beanstalk. And the child now is, because of the rich vein of storytelling and the real high expectations in terms of transcription, we can put the two things together. And it has explosive elements. You can see here Jack and his mummy had no money. Jack went to the market to sell his black and blue cow. He met a mysterious man and swapped his black and blue cow for some magic beans. Jack ran home. Jack told his mummy about the magic beans. Jack's mummy dashed the magic beans out the window, and on it goes. So what we're doing with Talk for Writing is we are thinking about mitigating the barriers to learning. We have to have a rich vein of composition. We have to have strong modelling of transcription, but we also need to understand that those two things need to come together. And this message now has been taken to a number of schools. Here's St Joseph's Catholic Primary. Here you've got in September a child starting to form letters, use those initial sounds, starting to piece it together, learning how to use the handwriting lines. What we see is this remarkable progress, because here is the same child in May. And you can see the power of what we were talking about earlier, that one night in the supermarket was quiet and everyone was sleeping. Suddenly, and you can see this, the sentence structure that we're starting to build. And then we have that first, he did this next, after that, unfortunately, luckily, finally. And so the structure of the story is so rich. We can work on orally strengthening what happens in between. And then because the child has the ability to actually say and retell this, which is especially true of children with English as additional language, helping them connect with the oracy first. If you can't say it, you're highly unlikely to be able to write it. And Talk for Writing starts with an oral approach first. We work on strengthening oracy so that when we're writing, we don't have to also be ladling on compositional pressures. We can start to work on transcription and really focus in on that high quality writing. Again, the progress you'll see in books and we see in children is vast. Here is a child in February, and you can see where they are in their transcription. It's almost, we can't really decipher that. But again, that's in February. What's happened is they've built a very strong bank. They've worked hard on their fine and gross motor skills. They've been working on story invention. They've worked hard on transcription. So here's the impact in May. It's mind-blowing. What we're doing is we're starting to knock down barriers of children and their perceptions of I'm not a good writer or I can't write. So what Talk for Writing is, when we get it right in our schools, it is a consistent, coherent whole school system. It grows all the way through the school and it develops with the children as they grow, all the way through into secondary. It's cumulative learning. There is a process, which is a logical sequence of learning, where everything's been carefully thought about. And I'll show you that in a second. And we teach our text types as little units. So we do fiction, and we go in depth into an area of it. And then we will do a non-fiction unit, where we'll really drill in and get all of those language patterns so that they're very, very familiar. The teaching is very explicit, which means that the children know exactly what they're focusing on. And therefore, we can really build our units, building on what's happened previously. So what we do on Monday is then built on Tuesday, which is then built on Wednesday. Well, at the heart of this is high expectations. We expect everyone to succeed because due to the way that Talk for Writing delivers support and scaffolding, every child will be successful. What we need to understand, and why you would need, if you wanted to take Talk for Writing into your school, you need to work with a trainer over time, is how to grow and develop this to suit the children in your class. So fundamentally, Talk for Writing has three big ideas. When you look at a unit of work, we start off by what we call imitation, and that's we get to know a text really well. We learn it, we internalize it, we dramatize it, we have great fun bringing it to life, acting in role, writing in role. Until all the children are able to retell that model text. And that model text is absolutely central to our learning. It contextualizes our grammar, our spelling, our tools, as we like to call them, that teach children how to be writers. And once they've got that, we then innovate, which means that we start to create new versions. And we do that through shared writing, where we write a new version with the class, into the guided writing, where we work with smaller groups working on their own sort of transcriptional and compositional needs, until over time, that third phase, they can independently apply their learning and make up stories. When you look at the pattern of Talk for Writing, it fundamentally follows metacognitive strategies. So we think about activating prior knowledge. We give them explicit strategy and instruction. We model learn strategies, help them memorize those strategies through guided practice, independent practice, so that we can then reflect and really tailor our future teaching. A lot of formative assessment driving the learning. So when you take the 7-step model as the EF have kind of identified, and you put it against what we do in Talk for Writing, you can see that the imitation phase is about that explicit strategy, the modeling and the memorization. But because that fundamentally, those strands are how we really at the heart of learning, we repeat them in the innovation phase. We go back into the explicit strategy. We model even more strategy, and we help them memorize. And that memorization is so key in them growing the confidence as writers over time. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of a sort of a journey, a case study, so to speak. Here is a child from one of our training centres in the north of England called Selby, just outside Derby. And in September, the child was asked, "Can you tell me a story?" Now, the child, who has English as an additional language, their exact words they said was, "A dinosaur is sleep, swimming, brush, hat, chair, sitting on chair." So automatically, as the teacher, we understand now by analysing that the child understands that stories need to have a character, and there will be other things that the character might be doing. But we're clearly lacking story structure. We're clearly lacking the understanding of the sequence. We need those sentence patterns. So the first thing we do is we hook the children into a great story, and they've chosen here the Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf. So there's the hook, as we would call it. It's a little bit of a setup. When the children arrive, something to spark their interest and enthusiasm. A letter from the wolf saying he's been huffing and puffing all over the playground and can't find them. And then the children would go in and start learning the story. So this is what we call a story map. And the story map is a pictorial representation of the story, because the first thing we do is we internalize the story before we look at the words. So the children now will go in, the teacher will lead them and learn the stories, so they can say, "Once upon a time there were 3 little pigs who lived in a house with their mummy," and on it goes. And you can see also into the continuous provision and play-based learning, so we can dramatize, we can use the 3D story map with that key language, constantly reinforcing that key language over time. Through the teaching, the children immerse themselves in story, so they constantly retell, revisit. In the classroom, they have the opportunity to engage with puppets. They have the opportunity to draw their own versions and story maps, so that there's a constant, really deep immersion in that whole story. So by the end of that imitation phase, the children will all know the story. They can retell the story. Now we're ready to innovate the story. Innovate the story is where we start to make changes. And again, that grows in various sort of sophisticated ways as you go through Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3. But in terms of early learning, here we generate lots of ideas. So you can see here, instead of the pigs, we're going to have caterpillars or ducks or rabbits. Instead of the wolf, we could have an elephant or a giant or a fox. And then with the post-it notes, we can go back to our story and start to substitute, change ideas, so that we can now retell that story with our new ideas. You can see here an example of the child through supported and guided writing, writing "Once upon a time there were 3 little pigs who lived with their mother," and on it goes, capturing, and they got lots of sentence checkers, making sure that when they're writing, we're really strengthening the writing process. All the way through the unit, the children are fully immersed in the story, coming up with new ideas. Here's we've got a story of the 3 little dragons, or those 3 little pegs. That could be anything your imagination wishes. So that the children, once they've retold the story and played with it, they could then have a go at drawing their story. Once they've drawn their story, they can retell their story, and will practice and strengthen the oracy. And with young children, that could be scribed. So here you have a child who's written, "One spring day, the 3 little pigs made a jail for the big bad wolf. Unfortunately, the big bad wolf was asleep." So the child has drawn it told an adult, so we've captured the composition. And that means with very young children, we can now help them. They've composed it, they've told it, they've memorized it. So when we come to actually write it, now we've got that child who we saw at the beginning, who was saying a dinosaur sleep sitting, and we didn't have a story. But by the end of this unit, we've now got one spring day, the three little pigs made a jail for the big bad wolf. Unfortunately, the big bad wolf was fast asleep, and the three little pigs shouted, "Big bad wolf, you want to play?" The big bad wolf woke up. He ran as fast as he could and fell in the jail. The three little pigs lived happily ever after. The end. A lovely little innovation. We can now analyze that and say, great, look at how much progress they've made in storytelling. There are now some things we want to work on and strengthen. And that very much is the journey of how talk for writing supports younger children. Clearly, there is far more for us to discuss and talk about. And that is why, if you wanted to bring talk for writing into your schools, we would say it's a minimum of 2 years working with a trainer over a project of training, looking at both the whole school training in the different phases, really strengthening both fiction and non-fiction, writing across the curriculum, but also the consultancy work where we help you build a curriculum, think about your reading, because reading is the heart of everything we do, writing model texts, building toolkits. There's a whole plethora of training that we work on schools over time so that you get that whole school consistency. Now, if you get that whole school consistency, what you'll see is the impact of talk for writing. So I'm going to leave you with the impact of a bit of data here. So Key Stage 2 across our training centres. And remember, the training centres, there are 16 schools. This is the data, the most recent data we've got because of the lockdown was in 2019. So the number of roll, we're talking about approximately 7,000 children. And these schools, many of them are in some of the most challenging areas in the UK. So on average, there's about 32% percentage of pupil premium, which is above the national expectation. On average, 42% EAL, but many of those schools actually have got 86 to 90% EAL. And actually one of the schools, St Matthew's, 87% pupil premium, 86% EAL, however, one of the highest performing schools in our country. So you can see the sort of demographic of the schools we're talking about. Now, what we've seen year on year on year is that these schools outperform and almost over double the national rate of improvement over the years, even though obviously some of them are in very highly deprived areas, some of them have very high proportions of English as additional language. So you can see the writing attainment, not only has it always outperformed the national average, but also it's growing systematically year on year as we learn and develop and further develop the principles and practices in the hands of teachers. At greater depth, as we would call over here, the sort of higher attaining children, again, this is really, really important that, again, we are outperforming national expectations, even though some of them are in some of these really, really challenging schools. The other thing that I would really advocate for is the way that Talk for Writing sort of sews together and brings English back together. From my opinion, when we brought it into my school, we were a large four-form entry school, and we were quite a high-performing school. But what was the issue was that the English curriculum was being pulled apart in many different ways, so that the timetable was becoming highly pressured with phonics and reading and spelling and handwriting and writing and all of the different elements and grammar. And what was happening is there wasn't an English vision or a curriculum. Talk for Writing puts it all back together. And what you'll see is the impact, not only in the writing, but in the understanding of the English language, in the way that grammar, punctuation and spelling supports it. Because we teach children to be writers. We don't just teach writing. And there's a fundamental difference in that, which really sits very central to our beliefs. So, if you want to raise standards in your school, I would strongly recommend you to have a look at this in more detail. What Talk for Writing does is it tunes into the 7 key drivers, works on motivation. So we look at building children's self-image as writers. It looks at providing a very rich and experimental and imaginative curriculum. You can devise that to suit your children. It's not a shop-bought system. We create this and we develop it to suit your school and your children. We increase the amount that children are read to, because reading, your best writers are readers. You won't escape that. We learn texts, we internalize them, we fuel the storehouse of possibility. We contextualize all of the teaching of phonics, spelling, grammar through lots of creative games and what we call short burst writing, which has a significant impact in children growing in confidence. And then the shared and guided writing, the showing the children, whole class, how to write a new one, then in the guided group supporting them so that we can be the model, because that goes back to how children learn. They need a model to learn from, and we can use our formative assessment and feedback to drive children on. If you want to find out more, this was a snippet. There are books. These 4 books are the key initial starting point. Talk for Writing, The Creating and Storytellers and Writers is your fiction guide, and that's really from sort of 5 to 12-year-olds. Before that, the Talk for Writing in the early years will take you from the nursery right through to the middle of sort of year 1, and the Talk for Writing across the curriculum is your non-fiction. In there is a lot more detail about the approach, takes you through all of the phases, worked examples, model texts, and there's also links to training material that you can watch and reflect on in order to develop your understanding of the approach. We've also just brought out, if you're in secondary, Transforming Learning Across the Curriculum. This is a new publication which is looking at how from upper primary through to sixth form we actually can really take the principles and practices of Talk for Writing and tune into the sort of subject matter and the language across our curriculum, thinking about how each subject really benefits from this methodology. As I said, if you are interested in either learning more through our online conferences, we are coming on an online conference in August. So we're going to be delivering a conference across many sort of schools in the Middle East, and we hope that will become a yearly thing. I think it is almost sold out, if not already, but if it is of interest, do get in contact. Do have a look at the online portal. On here there's many online courses that you can sign up to, but also there's details of working with a trainer. All of us now work remotely. We also can come out and work with you in your countries, wherever you are. So and we've been doing some great stuff with many schools across the Middle East, and we'd love to be able to support you in your journey. That's me. Thank you very much for listening. Obviously, if you've got questions, my email is there, link to my website's there. There's lots of little ideas and short burst writing ideas, lessons, and a bit more in-depth knowledge about Talk for Writing on my website, and also my Twitter handle's there. So if you've got any questions, do drop me an email, do ping me something on Twitter, and I hope that you decide that this is a great avenue for you to explore. Thank you very much.